In 2023, Audi sold 228,550 cars in the United States, its best year in over a decade. By 2026, according to figures that surfaced in a dealership lawsuit, the company privately expects to sell around 144,000. That is not a slump. That is more than a third of an entire national business gone in 3 years. Tariffs get some of the blame. Brutal competition from BMW and Mercedes gets some too. But neither of those explains why Audi spent the last 3 years renaming its own cars, reversing that renaming, redesigning its own logo, and then quietly dropping that logo altogether in the biggest market on earth. So here is the question worth answering. How does a brand built for decades on the promise of precision end up this confused about its own identity? Not confused about specs, not confused about the price, confused about which car is actually which. That is the story we are telling today. If you have not subscribed yet, now is a good moment. This channel breaks down the decisions behind the biggest names in business, and Audi's last 3 years might be the clearest case study in self-inflicted brand damage the auto industry has produced. To understand how strange this fall is, you first need to understand what Audi actually built. The company's slogan for over 40 years was Vorsprung durch Technik, advancement through technology. It was never just a marketing line. In the early 1980s, Audi introduced Quattro all-wheel drive to motorsport and dominated rally racing so completely that governing bodies rewrote the rules just to slow the cars down. That single technical decision built a reputation that outlasted the cars themselves. For the next 3 decades, an Audi badge meant genuine engineering advantage, not just premium styling. The endurance racing years only deepened that reputation. Between 1999 and 2014, Audi's diesel and hybrid prototypes won the 24 Hours of Le Mans 13 times, a level of sustained dominance almost no other manufacturer has matched at that race. Audi ran those wins directly through its road car marketing, using the phrase Vorsprung durch Technik as a bridge between the racetrack and the showroom floor. By the time an ordinary buyer walked into a dealership, the brand's engineering credibility had already been proven somewhere else first. Audi's touring car program added to that story too, with championship wins across Europe through the 2000s and 2010s that kept the brand's name in front of enthusiasts, even in years when its road cars were not the ones making headlines. By the 2000s, the company had converted that reputation into real market share. It positioned itself as the thinking driver's alternative to BMW and Mercedes. Less flash, more substance. Interiors that critics ranked among the best in the industry for over a decade running. And underneath all of it sat a naming system every customer understood without being told. A for sedans and hatchbacks, Q for SUVs. A bigger number meant a bigger car in that same family. Dealers could explain the entire lineup in one sentence. Ask a salesperson what an A6 was in 2010, and the answer took 5 words. A mid-size sedan, one size up from the A4. That is the kind of clarity most brands spend decades trying to build and rarely fully achieve. That consistency paid off in hard numbers. Audi cleared 200,000 annual US sales for 5 consecutive years between 2015 and 2019. Then, rather than fade after the pandemic like some rivals, it broke its own record in 2023, moving 228,550 cars in America alone. Globally, the brand was selling into the millions every year. This was not a company in trouble. This was a company at its peak, respected for engineering, and, just as importantly, respected for being easy to understand. But that is exactly where the story turns. In 2022, Audi's leadership made a decision that would unravel a naming logic customers had trusted for a generation. Then, Chief Executive Markus Duesmann announced that the entire lineup would be split by powertrain. Going forward, odd numbers would mark combustion cars, even numbers would mark electric ones. In a boardroom presentation, it sounded clean. On paper, it promised buyers instant clarity about what kind of car they were looking at, without reading a spec sheet. In practice, it meant the Audi A4, a nameplate customers had bought for over 20 years, would become the A5 and remain a gas car. A new, unrelated electric model would eventually inherit the A4 name instead. The combustion A6 was scheduled to become the A7. Audi's first modern electric car, simply called e-tron, was renamed Q8 e-tron to fit the new logic. This was not a badge tweak. Audi was rewriting the alphabet its customers had memorized for a generation, and it was doing so in service of an electric timeline the company had not yet proven it could actually deliver on schedule. Keep that timing detail in mind because it matters later. At almost the same moment, Audi's design team was overhauling the logo too. In 2022, the company flattened its famous 4 rings, stripping away the chrome and dimension that had defined the badge for decades. Fans noticed immediately. On Audi's own owner forums, one recurring complaint was that the new mark looked pasted on, like an afterthought rather than a redesign. Then in November 2024, the company went further still. For a new electric sub-brand launched with Chinese partner SAIC, Audi dropped the rings completely, replacing them with a plain 4-letter word mark. China is Audi's single largest market on Earth. In that market, for the first time in 90 years, new Audi models would leave the factory without the badge that made the brand recognizable in the first place. The reaction from Audi's own fan community was not subtle. On the brand's largest online forums and discussion boards, owners described the flattened badge as looking cheap and questioned why a company known for premium build quality would trade a badge you could feel with your hand for a graphic that renders the same on a phone screen. When the China wordmark dropped the rings entirely months later, that reaction only sharpened, with longtime enthusiasts calling it the end of an era for a logo that had survived 90 years of automotive history intact. So within a span of roughly 2 years, Audi asked its customers to accept a new naming logic, a new flattened logo, and in its biggest market, no logo at all. 3 separate identity overhauls stacked on top of each other with no gap between them for anyone to actually adjust. Not only was the naming system in flux, but the badge underneath it was also changing at the exact same time, and there is a pattern here worth noting because this was not Audi's first identity reversal. In 2017, the brand had already scrapped an older naming convention, one that used simple engine labels like TFSI and TDI, in favour of numerical codes such as 40, 50 and 55 meant to represent power output. That system confused buyers as well. So the odd and even split arriving in 2022 was not a company finding its footing. It was a company still recovering from its last naming mistake, choosing to make an even bigger one. So what was actually happening inside Audi during these years? 2 different overhauls running on 2 different timelines, both aimed at the same goal of looking more modern for an electric future, neither one checking with the other about whether customers could absorb both changes at once. The naming team was solving for powertrain clarity. The design team was solving for a flatter, more digital-looking badge. Nobody appears to have asked whether stacking both changes on top of a customer base that had just recovered from the 2017 naming confusion was a good idea at all. 2 teams, 2 timelines, 1 shared customer who was expected to relearn the brand twice in the same 2-year window. Then came the reversal, and it did not take long to arrive. In February 2025, barely 2 years after announcing the odd-even split, Audi scrapped it entirely. The company acknowledged that customer and dealer feedback had confirmed the system created more confusion than clarity. The upcoming A7 would now launch as the A6 instead. Electric models would keep the e-tron badge. Combustion cars would return to TFSI and TDI labels for petrol and diesel. Audi's head of sales and marketing framed the reversal as a direct response to months of feedback from customers and international dealers. Here is where that earlier timing detail comes back around. Remember the A4 becoming the A5. Audi confirmed there would be no retroactive fix for that one. The new A5 stays the A5 permanently, uncoupled from the exact naming logic that justified changing it in the first place. So even the walk back left a scar behind. 2 nameplates on sale today that only exist because of a policy the company itself now admits did not work. Picture the actual showroom conversation that creates. A customer walks in asking about the A5 they remember, only to learn Audi now sells 2 unrelated cars sharing that badge, one running on gasoline and one running purely on batteries, with nothing about the name itself telling them which is which. That is the exact confusion the odd-even system was supposed to prevent. Instead, thanks to the partial reversal, It is the one permanent example still sitting on the lot. And the naming reversal was not the only about-face that year. Weeks later, under the new chief executive Gernot Döllner, Audi quietly abandoned an even more consequential decision, its own electric vehicle deadline. The original plan, set by previous management, called for Audi to stop developing new combustion engines by 2033, to sell only electric cars soon after. Döllner confirmed combustion and hybrid models would now continue well past that date, depending on demand. That same month, Audi closed its Brussels manufacturing plant, a facility that had been building the very electric models the entire naming and logo overhaul was designed around in the first place. On top of that, the company has since rotated its technical leadership twice, bringing in a new development board member from Lamborghini in March, and reassigning its China EV chief to Lamborghini's top technical role for the following summer. Döllner has also cut an entire layer of middle management and eliminated nearly all internal committees, arguing that decisions needed to sit closer to the actual product. That is not the language of a company executing a steady plan. That is the language of a company that knows its last few plans did not work and is trying to shorten the distance between deciding on something and living with it. So line up what that actually means. Audi renamed its lineup to make an electric future legible to customers. It redesigned its logo for that same electric future. It dropped the badge outright in China for that future. Then, before any of it had time to settle, the company backed away from the timeline that had justified doing all of it in the first place. On paper, each decision looked defensible. It wasn't. Meanwhile, the sales numbers kept getting worse, not better, through every one of these reversals. US deliveries fell 14% in 2024. They fell another 16% in 2025, Audi's worst American performance of the decade. Core SUVs took the heaviest hits, with the Q3 down 27%, the Q5 down 19%, and the Q7 down 12% for the year. Only a handful of models actually grew, and one of them briefly looked like proof the strategy was working. The Q6 e-tron jumped from 966 US sales in 2024 to over 17,000 in 2025, a number Audi's own sales chief pointed to as evidence its electric product push was finally landing. Then came the first quarter of 2026, and that story fell apart too. Audi sold 29,886 cars in the United States between January and March, a 30% drop year over year, and the first time in 14 years the brand failed to clear 30,000 units in a single quarter. Electric models, the exact segment the naming and branding overhaul existed to promote, collapsed by more than 90% across nearly every EV nameplate in that same quarter. The Q6 e-tron, last year's supposed proof point, fell from 3,246 units to just 309. Not a single Q8 e-tron was sold in the US in those 3 months. China slid too, down 12% in the same quarter, with Audi citing tough market conditions alongside logistics disruption tied to the war in Iran. Globally, group deliveries fell 6.1% to 360,106 vehicles for the quarter. Zoom out to the full picture, and the regions tell slightly different stories. Europe held roughly flat across 2025 at 464,000 deliveries. China, still Audi's largest single market, slipped 5% to 618,000 for the year. None of those numbers is catastrophic on its own. What makes them worse is that they are happening at the same time as 3 straight years of identity confusion in the exact markets Audi needed to feel most stable. Then a lawsuit let slip what Audi had never been willing to say in public. A Long Island dealership suing Audi of America over how sales incentive programs were structured forced the release of an internal court filing. Buried inside it was Audi's own 2026 sales forecast, a number the company had never announced. Roughly 144,000 vehicles for the full year in the US, down another 13% from an already weak 2025, down 37% from the 228,550 the brand sold at its 2023 peak. If that figure holds, 2026 will be Audi's weakest American sales year since 2012, before the naming split, before the logo redesign, before any of the last 3 years of reinvention had even been imagined. The damage is not confined to the sales chart either. BMW sold more of a single electric SUV, the iX, than all 6 of Audi's electric SUVs combined that same quarter. Both BMW and Mercedes posted deliveries far ahead of Audi's total in every segment, without a single exception. Dealership analysts now report that Audi franchises trade at a discount compared to other luxury brands, a direct reflection of falling throughput and thinner margins at the store level. The kind of number that shows up on a balance sheet long after the branding meetings are over. Units in operation, the total pool of Audi cars already on the road, generating service and parts revenue, are also starting to shrink for the first time in years, which means the pain from these last 3 years will not stop at the sales chart. It follows the brand into its dealership service bays for years to come. Audi knows it has a problem, and it is not standing still. A new Q3 is already rolling out. A redesigned Q7 and the brand's first ever Q9 flagship are both due before the end of 2026, aimed squarely at American buyers who want something bigger than what Audi currently offers. Alongside those, the company has shown off something called the Concept C, a sports car study that Audi itself has described as a signal of a new design direction, one it hopes will eventually filter down into the higher volume models that actually pay the bills. On paper, this looks like the reinvention Audi needs. Whether it works depends entirely on whether the company can resist the urge to change its mind again halfway through. So what actually went wrong? It came down to 3 mistakes. First, Audi tied its entire naming identity, the thing a customer uses to recognize a car in a parking lot, to an electric vehicle timeline, which the company was not actually certain it could keep. When that timeline moved, and it did move, the naming logic built around it stopped making any sense at all. A system meant to signal confidence about the future ended up signaling the opposite the moment the future changed. Second, the company ran 3 separate identity overhauls, the naming split, the flattened logo, and the China rebrand, inside the same short window, on top of a naming mistake from 2017 it had barely finished recovering from. Any one of these alone might have been survivable. A customer can absorb one change and move on. Stacked together, with no gap for customers or dealers to adjust between them, they compounded into a brand nobody, not even its own dealers, could describe consistently anymore. Third, Audi reversed nearly all of it within about 2 years, which meant the certainty it had sold to customers turned out not to be certainty at all. That is the part that lingers longest. A brand can survive being wrong once. Being wrong invites a correction, and customers generally accept corrections. What is far harder to survive is being visibly indecisive, twice in full public view, while the sales numbers keep sliding underneath every reversal. Indecision reads differently from error. The error says we made a mistake. Indecision says we do not actually know where we are going, and that is a much harder thing for a premium brand to recover from. Audi still builds some of the most capable cars in its class. Reviewers still rate its interiors highly. The engineering behind Quattro is still respected across the industry. That part was never the problem. The problem is a company that spent 30 years training customers to trust its judgment, then spent 3 years asking those same customers to keep up with judgment that kept changing its own mind, twice, in public, while the sales figures kept sliding underneath every announcement. Whether the Q9, the Concept C, and the refreshed lineup coming through 2026 and 2027 actually turn this around will depend on something Audi has not shown much of lately: restraint. The discipline to pick a direction and stay in it long enough for customers to actually learn it.